70 years ago, in a small town in Alabama, a 4-year-old boy vanished without a trace, leaving his family shattered and a community gripped by confusion. Authorities quickly stepped in, but the scene had been disturbed. Witness statements were contradictory, and there was no strong physical evidence, causing the investigation to stall early and eventually be classified as a cold case. Even so, over all those years, the surviving loved ones continued to live with a lingering anguish, clinging to the faint possibility that the boy might never have truly left this world. Then, decades later, in an unexpected context, a seemingly harmless clue emerged and struck right at the void left by the case, forcing the past to speak for itself. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you find this content thought-provoking, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next cases. In 1952, Alabama still carried the thick atmosphere of post-World War II America, a slow-paced rural society where people trusted the natural order of the community more than protective institutions, where doors were often left unlocked, children played in yards and streets with little adult supervision, and danger was seen as something belonging to distant cities rather than the peaceful small towns scattered among the famed forests of the South. In that setting, the Smith family was a typical working-class household, living in a modest home on the outskirts of town, following the regular rhythm of the era, parents working fixed shifts, neighbors who had known each other for years, children in the neighborhood, playing together and being loosely watched based on the belief that everyone knows whose child is whose. James Smith, the 4-year-old youngest child, was small for his age, with light-colored hair, an energetic but not overly mischievous personality. He was accustomed to playing within sight of adults, usually staying close to family rather than wandering off on his own, and this familiarity made it seem unremarkable for the family to let him be outside in the yard or around the house. On that day, James went about his routine as usual, playing near the house under the indirect supervision of relatives, with no signs of tension, no arguments or disturbances in the family, until a small but unusual factor appeared. It wasn't big enough to cause immediate panic, but sufficient to become the starting point for the chain of mistakes that followed. It could have been the appearance of a stranger in the area, a situation that temporarily distracted the adults, or a subjective decision that James was still nearby. The initial reactions of those who noticed were hesitant rather than alert. Fleeting suspicion was quickly replaced by the thought that it wasn't worth making a big deal out of, that a 4-year-old couldn't have gone far, that everything would return to normal if they just waited a little longer. This very hesitation caused the initial warning signs to go unrecognized. The period during which James slipped out of sight was very brief. No cries for help were reported, and there was no clear action indicating a serious incident had occurred. When his loved ones realized James was no longer in his usual spot, their first response was still to search within a small radius around the house, calling his name on the assumption that he was just hiding somewhere or had followed another child in the neighborhood. The spontaneous search quickly spread to the neighbors, who joined in with a spirit of helpfulness rather than alarm. Each person offered an uncertain piece of information. Some thought they had seen James not long ago, others believed he might have gone down a familiar path, but no one could confirm exactly when or in which direction he had gone. As time passed and daylight began to fade, the search area expanded without results. The family's worry gradually turned to panic, as their initial assumptions were one by one disproven. James didn't come back, he didn't appear at any familiar place, and only then did they have to confront the possibility that this was no longer a harmless delay. The decision to call the police was made in a state of tension and desperation, marking the moment when James Smith was officially declared a missing child. It closed the fragile piece of what had seemed like a completely ordinary day, and opened an unfillable void in the lives of those left behind. The missing person report was received in a context with no clear signs of a serious crime, and that very fact shaped the initial response of local authorities. Where child disappearances were rare, and usually assumed to be temporary situations involving a child wandering off or going with someone known. The information provided by the family was recorded quickly and concisely, focusing on James Smith's name, age, basic description, the last time he was seen, and the area around the house, but without any strong elements to immediately trigger a large-scale emergency protocol. Meanwhile, the police had to handle many other routine tasks during their shift, and did not yet consider this case a top priority. After receiving the report, an investigator was assigned to the file with the task of conducting initial verification. This person met directly with the family to clarify the circumstances of the disappearance, checked for any duplicate information, and ruled out the possibility that James was simply at a relative's or acquaintance's home, while also noting the family's panicked state but lack of specific details, which further reinforced the initial assessment that this might be a brief absence. At the same time, the crime scene perimeter was defined based on where James was last seen and his usual play areas, including the family home, front yard, the small road leading into the neighborhood, and the paths commonly used by children in the area. However, this determination came after the area had already been disturbed by the family's and neighbors' spontaneous search efforts, leaving potential physical evidence no longer in its original state, so the police could only rely on verbal descriptions rather than direct evidence. During this process, the investigator began establishing a preliminary timeline, focusing on the period from when James was last seen until the family realized he was no longer under their watch. But this timeline quickly revealed major gaps due to inaccuracies in witnesses' memories. The time points provided were only estimates, influenced by emotions and panic, making it difficult from the start to establish an accurate time frame. The analysis of this preliminary timeline also revealed an unfavorable reality. No one had been continuously watching James throughout the period leading up to his disappearance. This forced investigators to rely on the assumption that the boy had left the familiar area in a very short time without anyone noticing, an assumption that was both common and dangerous because it tended to delay consideration of more serious possibilities. To build the initial picture, police tried to identify the last person believed to have seen James, an important step to narrow the investigation, but the process was complicated by inconsistent accounts. Some said they had seen the boy playing near the house just minutes before the family began searching, while others believed the last sighting had occurred much earlier. This discrepancy made it impossible to establish a reliable final point of reference. Nevertheless, the primary caregiver that day was identified as the central figure in the initial investigation phase, not as a suspect, but as a key source of information about the boy's habits, behavior, and any unusual changes before he vanished. Investigators focused on extracting small details, whether the boy had shown any unusual reactions, whether anyone appeared in the area, or whether there was any interruption in supervision, but the information gathered remained fragmented and did not lead to a specific investigative direction. In the absence of physical evidence and reliable witnesses, the authorities chose a cautious approach, continuing to treat the case as a disappearance of unknown cause rather than an abduction. This decision directly affected the pace and priority level of subsequent actions, creating a period of time that passed without any breakthrough, as all efforts remained centered on verifying basic information and hoping James would be found nearby. The family, meanwhile, was caught between two opposing states, faint hope that their child had simply wandered off, and growing fear as each hour passed without news. It was during this activation phase that the initial choices, though reasonable given the era and limited information, unintentionally laid the foundation for a prolonged search filled with uncertainty. When the initial investigation was activated, without a clear sense of urgency, sealing off the crime scene did not happen immediately. It was delayed by both subjective assumptions and the reality that the area around the Smith family home had already become a gathering point for relatives and neighbors beforehand. With good intentions to help, these people had been moving around constantly, turning over places where a child might hide, calling James's name along familiar paths. This heavy foot traffic seriously disturbed a space that could have provided clues before the police were fully on site to take control. By the time authorities defined the crime scene perimeter, natural signs such as small footprints in the dirt, disturbed grass or foliage, or any subtle physical details that might indicate James's initial direction of movement, had already been overlaid by the traces of adults, other children, and vehicles, making it nearly impossible to distinguish what was directly related to the victim. The primary crime scene was identified around the house and James's usual activity areas, but this designation was more formal than substantive, because boundaries were not established from the start. No police tape, no access control, and all actions took place in a mixed state of search and investigation, blurring the line between rescue efforts and evidence preservation. During the initial sweep, police found no clear physical traces, such as clothing, toys, or personal items belonging to James, in the area near the house. This result was both alarming and confusing. It neither supported the theory of an on-site accident, nor provided direct evidence for the theory of abduction. The absence of physical evidence meant all lines of reasoning were based on speculation rather than facts. The lack of traces also reflected a major limitation of investigative work at that time. Evidence collection and preservation methods were still rudimentary, with no standardized procedures for documenting small details that might be overlooked, and no technology to detect subtle signs invisible to the naked eye. This meant the crime scene, even after being searched, still said nothing of investigative value. At the same time, investigators continued trying to reconstruct the timeline of that day, but the effort quickly ran into a major gap that could not be filled. The period between the last relatively certain sighting of James and the moment the family realized he was no longer under their watch had no direct witnesses, no precise time markers, and no continuous supervision, making that gap a blind spot from the very first hours of the investigation. Subsequent witness statements only further highlighted the uncertainty of this gap, as each person provided a different time frame based on personal perception rather than systematic observation. Some believed James was still playing near the house just minutes before the family started searching, while others said they hadn't seen him for a much longer period. These differences could not be cross-checked or verified due to the lack of records and storage methods, so the exact moment James left the area could not be determined. That time gap was not just a technical issue, but a key factor influencing the entire direction of the investigation. Without knowing when he disappeared, determining direction of travel, speed, or possible contact with others became vague, and every hypothesis rested on an uncertain foundation. Meanwhile, the delayed sealing of the scene also meant that entry and exit routes to the neighborhood went uncontrolled during the most critical time window. There was no record of vehicles or strangers passing through the area at the sensitive time, and no way to backtrack those movements after time had passed, creating an irreparable information gap. Subsequent follow-up searches, including rechecking surrounding areas and interviewing additional witnesses, only reinforced the conclusion that the crime scene had lost its investigative value from the beginning, as potential signs had been erased, and small details had not been documented in time. For the family, watching police work in an already disturbed space brought no reassurance. On the contrary, it heightened their anxiety when they realized there was no concrete evidence to hold on to. For the investigators, the absence of physical traces and the unreconstructible time gap forced them to acknowledge that the investigation was starting with a serious disadvantage, where the most basic questions about where James had gone and how remained unanswered. These limitations, appearing right in the crime scene handling phase, created the foundation for a prolonged investigation full of dead ends, where every subsequent step had to rely on inference rather than evidence, and that first gap became an irreparable crack in the entire process of searching for James Smith. Once the crime scene no longer provided any valuable physical clues, the focus of the investigation had to shift entirely to human testimony, and from that point onward, witnesses became virtually the only source of information to reconstruct what happened during the period when James disappeared, a task that was already difficult and became even more complicated due to the social context of 1952, when the recording, storage, and verification of statements lacked the rigorous procedures that would come later. Investigators began by taking statements from family members, those present in the house or in the surrounding area that day, with the goal of establishing the usual daily routine, the last time James was seen, and any details that might be considered unusual. But right from the initial conversations, they had to confront the overlap between emotion and memory, as family members, in a state of extreme anxiety, could not provide precise time markers and could only estimate based on habits or subjective feelings. In parallel, statements were collected from neighbors and others living nearby, including those who believed they had seen James playing outside, those who only glimpsed a child resembling James, or those who saw nothing unusual but were still questioned to rule out the possibility of oversight. This diversity in levels of exposure made the collection of statements fragmented, with each person holding only a very small piece of information, insufficient on its own to become a clear lead. When investigators tried to compare the provided time markers, inconsistencies quickly emerged, as the same period of the day was described differently depending on the narrator. Some claimed James was still near the house just minutes before the family began searching, while others believed they had not seen the boy for a significantly longer time. These discrepancies could not be resolved through objective cross-checking, as there was no shared clock, no independent records, and no physical evidence to support them. Efforts to build a preliminary timeline thus became more about arranging assumptions than establishing facts, with investigators having to select time markers that seemed reasonable as a temporary framework, while accepting that this framework could change at any moment if new information emerged, an approach that was flexible but carried the risk of reinforcing initial assumptions that had not been fully verified. During the analysis of the statements, contradictions appeared not only between different witnesses, but also within the account of the same person when questioned again, because human memory, especially in stressful situations, tends to restructure itself according to what the narrator believes is logical or desirable, and each retelling can unintentionally adjust details to better fit the emerging overall picture in the community. This posed a major challenge for investigators, who had to distinguish between original memory and memory influenced by subsequent discussions, but lacked effective tools to do so. Statements were mainly handwritten, with no audio or video recordings for verbatim comparison, no precise timestamps for each answer, and no way to track changes in the account over time. The absence of modern data storage and management technology also made compiling statements cumbersome, as records were scattered across paper files, difficult to search quickly, and easily overlooked. Any attempt to cross-reference information depended on the personal memory and notes of the responsible investigator, a highly subjective factor. In that context, identifying the last person to see James became an especially difficult task, as the list of potential final witnesses varied, depending on which timeline was accepted, and each change led to a different line of reasoning about the time James left the area, possible speed of movement, and likelihood of contact with others. This forced investigators to work on multiple scenarios simultaneously, none of which was certain enough to rule out the others. Additionally, some statements were recorded not from direct observation but from speculation or hearsay, yet in the absence of standardized recording protocols, the boundary between primary and secondary information was not always clearly distinguished, leading to unreliable details potentially being incorporated into the temporary timeline without proper marking. The delay in completing the collection of statements made the problem even more serious. As time passed, witnesses' memories faded or were unconsciously altered. Small details such as position, direction of movement, or time intervals became blurred, and the initial answers, already lacking precision, became even harder to verify. The result of this entire process was a constructed timeline full of gaps, sufficient to provide a reference framework for further investigative steps, but not solid enough to serve as a reliable foundation. Unresolved contradictions in witness statements became a persistent layer of noise that followed the case from the very beginning. Without adequate recording and storage tools, each review of the file only highlighted additional ambiguities rather than providing new answers, causing the gaps in the timeline not only to persist, but to tend to widen. This placed the investigation in a precarious state, where decisions had to be made based on incomplete information. It was precisely in this phase of witnesses and timeline that the limitations of methods and tools left a deep mark on the entire process of searching for James Smith, creating a fragile foundation that all subsequent investigative efforts had to bear. The instability of the timeline constructed from witness statements caused the human-centered approach to gradually reach its limits, forcing the search efforts to shift focus to the physical space surrounding the residential area in the hope that terrain and natural environment would provide more concrete clues than memory already disrupted by emotion and time. From there, search operations expanded both in scope and scale, mobilizing local police units, support teams, and large numbers of volunteer citizens organized into various groups. The area to be searched was no longer limited to the Smith family home or the familiar paths used by children in the neighborhood, but extended to the dense forest patches at the edge of town, ditches, ponds and small streams running through the locality, as well as vacant lots, abandoned sheds, and rarely visited structures, places where a 4-year-old child could accidentally wander into or be taken without attracting attention. The complex terrain posed many challenges. Dense woods limited visibility, uneven ground concealed traces, and riverine areas were both dangerous and difficult to access, requiring careful coordination among search groups. In practice, however, coordination did not always achieve the necessary consistency, as the large community involvement, while providing abundant manpower, created a situation of parallel, non-standardized operations where some areas were checked multiple times, while others were only skimmed or even overlooked. Information from search groups was transmitted unevenly, mainly through oral reports or scattered notes, making compilation and evaluation difficult. This increased the risk that a small but important detail could have been spotted and then overlooked without proper recording. In that context, the discovery of an item believed to be related to James became the most prominent event of the expanded search phase, as it was the first time since the boy disappeared that the search had a specific physical element to cling to, instead of relying solely on statements and assumptions. This item was found in a location outside James's usual activity range, but still within a radius accessible to a child, and this intermediate position made the value of the evidence difficult to assess. It neither directly confirmed the hypothesis of an on-site accident, nor was far enough to assert that James had been taken away by some means. The condition of the item also provided no clear answers, no signs of serious damage or traces suggesting violence, nor any features allowing precise determination of when it appeared there, forcing all inferences to rely on possibilities rather than evidence. The handling of the evidence under the technical conditions of the time further diminished its exploitable value. No strict preservation protocols, no ability to analyze biological or microscopic traces, and evaluations based mainly on visual observation and logical inference. This made the evidence both a source of hope for a new direction and a source of ambiguity, as it could not answer key questions about its origin and significance. Alongside the analysis of the found item, authorities had to face the difficult task of re-evaluating the two main possibilities existing in parallel. One, that James had suffered an accident while moving on his own, wandered into a dangerous area, and could not return, and another, that the boy had been taken away from family supervision by some individual. The accident hypothesis was based on the natural environment and James's young age, with the argument that a small child could easily get lost in the woods or fall near water. However, this argument faced doubts when the most dangerous areas had been searched multiple times without finding corresponding signs: no clothing, no signs of sliding or falling, and no evidence of a natural incident within the search radius. The abduction possibility, though more alarming, lacked direct evidence. No reliable witness confirmed seeing James with a stranger, no records of suspicious vehicles, and the only physical evidence could not clearly indicate coercion, rather than accidental loss. The parallel existence of these two possibilities created a tug-of-war in decision-making, where over-prioritizing one direction risked missing leads from the other, while search resources were limited, and pressure from family and community grew. For James's family, each new search brought fragile hope that their son would be found, but the repetition of fruitless days gradually turned that hope into exhaustion and despair, a psychological state that spread through the community, as people realized that despite maximum effort, no answer emerged. On the investigative side, an expanded search without decisive evidence forced them to acknowledge that the scene and surrounding environment might no longer hold what was needed to answer the core question, and the found evidence, instead of opening a clear path, became a point of intersection for conflicting hypotheses. The result of this phase was an investigation picture lacking focus. The area had been searched to the maximum feasible extent, but provided no definitive solution. The evidence was suggestive, but not compelling, and the two possibilities of accident and abduction continued to coexist as unexcluded hypotheses, placing the entire search in a state of limbo full of uncertainty, where every step forward required a trade-off between hope and reality, and where the question of James Smith's fate remained suspended between the forests, waters, and information voids that no one could fill. The deadlock formed from the expanded search and the limited value of the physical evidence forced the investigating agency to systematize all collected data and place them into specific hypothetical frameworks to determine the most feasible direction, an essential step to avoid continuing to waste resources in an aimless probing state. In that context, three main hypotheses were formed in parallel, each reflecting a different explanation for James Smith's disappearance, but all carrying inherent limitations that were difficult to overcome. The first hypothesis posited that James had voluntarily left his familiar activity area and gotten lost, a common scenario for 4-year-old children, whose sense of direction is limited and whose curiosity can easily lead them farther than intended. This hypothesis was based on the fact that James often played around the house. The surrounding area had many small paths not all under supervision, and there was no direct evidence of intervention by others. However, the biggest limitation of the lost hypothesis lay in the results of the field search areas with the highest likelihood had been combed multiple times, without finding corresponding traces, no signs that James continued moving for a long time, and the found evidence was insufficient to confirm a prolonged spontaneous journey, making this hypothesis, while theoretically reasonable, lacking support from reality. The second hypothesis focused on the possibility of an accident, in which James may have encountered an incident while moving, such as slipping near water or falling into an obscured location. This was supported by the terrain features around the residential area and the victim's very young age, leaving him unable to protect himself in a complex natural environment. Yet the limitations of this direction quickly became apparent when the most dangerous areas were thoroughly checked without finding signs of a serious accident, no clothing, no signs of disturbed earth or rocks, and no indication that an incident had occurred within the search radius. This made the accident hypothesis impossible to completely rule out, but not strong enough to become the central explanation. The third hypothesis, the most serious one, suggested that James had been abducted or taken away from the area by another individual, a possibility rarely mentioned in the early stages due to the social context of the time and the widespread belief that such acts rarely occurred in small communities. This hypothesis was based on James's complete absence from searched areas, the lack of accident indicators, and the found evidence being in a location not entirely consistent with spontaneous scenarios. But its biggest limitation was the lack of direct evidence. No reliable witness confirmed seeing James with a stranger. No records of suspicious vehicles entering or leaving the area, and no physical traces indicating coercion had occurred, leaving this hypothesis, though alarming, at the level of speculation. Placing these three hypotheses side by side was not aimed at quickly selecting a single direction, but at evaluating each scenario's fit with the available data. In that evaluation process, investigators realized that each hypothesis explained some aspects of the case, but left key questions unanswered, creating a fragile balance where no hypothesis was strong enough to completely rule out the others. The common limitation of all three investigative directions lay in the quality and quantity of input information. An unstable timeline, a disturbed crime scene, and non-decisive evidence meant all analysis had to rely on inference rather than verified proof. In that context, prioritizing one hypothesis too early risked skewing the investigation and missing important leads related to the other directions. At the same time, pressure from family and community demanding quick answers created underlying tension, forcing investigators to balance the need for action with the requirement for caution, as any misstep in hypothesis evaluation could push the case deeper into deadlock. The parallel existence of these hypotheses also reflected an unavoidable reality of investigations in that era. Lacking scientific tools and objective data to quickly confirm or refute scenarios, analysis depended heavily on personal experience and subjective judgment, increasing the risk that elements inconsistent with initial assumptions might be downplayed or overlooked. The result of the hypothesis evaluation phase was a clear realization that the case could not be resolved through simplification or reduction. Each investigative direction needed to be maintained at a minimum level to avoid missing key possibilities. But limited resources did not allow pursuing all hypotheses with equal priority, creating a tug-of-war in investigative strategy. In that state, James Smith's disappearance was no longer viewed as a single event with a clear solution, but as a problem with many unknowns, where the choice of which hypothesis to focus on was influenced not only by data, but also by social context, professional experience, and the insurmountable limitations of the time. This overlapping evaluation shaped how the investigation continued to operate, with directions retained not because they were certainly correct, but because none had enough evidence to be completely eliminated. The parallel existence of investigative hypotheses, none of which is convincing enough to become the dominant direction, pushes the investigation into a fragile phase where every new piece of information, no matter how small, is expected to break the deadlock. It is precisely in this context that a late lead emerges, not from the crime scene or physical evidence, but from an indirect source of information transmitted through hearsay or unofficial reports, carrying the hope that a detail might finally narrow the search scope. This lead, though not described with specific evidence, suggests that James may have been seen or taken to a location outside the initial search area, a possibility already considered in the abduction hypothesis but never supported by any anchor. For this reason, it immediately draws the attention of investigators who are under heavy pressure from the prolonged lack of clear progress. However, right from the start of its evaluation, the reliability of this lead raises many doubts. The source did not witness the event directly, but only heard about it from others. The timing of the alleged incident is described vaguely, and key details such as the exact location, means of transportation, or individuals involved remain unclear. This makes the lead resemble a puzzle piece with missing edges rather than a solid element that can fit securely into the investigative picture. Verification efforts are carried out to the extent possible, including recontacting the original source, asking questions to clarify details, and checking whether any other statements or facts match. But the process quickly reveals that the lead cannot withstand cross-examination. Each deeper inquiry exposes additional inconsistencies or unexplainable gaps. The lack of tools and supporting data prevents investigators from verifying the lead independently. No travel records, no official reports, and no direct witnesses to compare against, while revisiting the potential scene suggested by the lead yields no results, as enough time has passed for any traces that might have existed to be erased. The failure to verify not only diminishes the value of this specific lead, but also negatively impacts the overall morale of the investigation, reinforcing the sense that even the latest glimmers of hope are insufficient to change the reality of lacking evidence. Within the investigative team, this late lead is treated as a final test for the existing hypotheses. When it cannot be convincingly integrated into any investigative direction, the perception of the case's limits becomes clearer. If even a new piece of information cannot be verified or open a specific path forward, the chances of achieving a breakthrough under current conditions are very low. This leads to investigative activities beginning to slow, not due to lack of goodwill, but due to the exhaustion of viable leads, as every hypothesis has been reasonably examined and every relevant area has been searched within the limits of available resources. The investigation's stagnation does not occur as a sudden decision, but as the result of a gradual slowdown. Internal meetings become shorter, update reports no longer bring new information, and priority for the case decreases amid other ongoing demands for resources, a reality unavoidable in a law enforcement system with limited budget and personnel. For James's family, the prolonged silence following this late lead carries particular weight, marking the moment when even the smallest pieces of information cease to appear, and hope nourished by every vague rumor gradually gives way to helplessness when there is nothing left to hold on to. From a professional perspective, this phase starkly reveals the investigation's limitations. Reliance on indirect statements and unofficial information cannot replace physical evidence or objective data. The late lead, instead of opening new doors, becomes proof of the depletion of reliable information sources. The inability to verify it also means there is no basis for reasonably expanding the search scope or altering investigative strategy, as any expansion at this point would be more speculative than analytical. In this context, justifying the continued maintenance of the case in an active investigative status becomes difficult when the costs in time and resources no longer match the potential for results. Although no official declaration of closure is made, the reality shows the case entering a state of dormancy, where activities are more about file maintenance than pursuing answers. This deadlock is not merely the consequence of an unverifiable lead, but the culmination of all accumulated limitations from the start: a contaminated scene, an unstable timeline, inconclusive physical evidence, and mutually exclusive hypotheses. The late lead appearing in this phase serves only as the final sign that, under present conditions, James Smith's disappearance has reached a threshold where further efforts no longer yield substantial progress. When investigators are forced to admit there are no reasonable next steps without relying on luck, the investigation falls into a suspended state, neither closed nor advancing, and this very suspension creates a prolonged void, where questions about James's fate persist without answers, and the final lead, instead of becoming a key, becomes a temporary full stop to a phase of exhaustive but fruitless searching. The suspended state that formed after the final lead failed to withstand verification gradually transforms into a systemic reality, where the investigation into James Smith's disappearance is no longer maintained as an active file, but begins sliding into a passive waiting mode. This shift occurs quietly, without any symbolic decision being announced, but manifests through a series of small yet consistent adjustments in how the authorities allocate attention, personnel, and time. The case's priority level drops noticeably, internal reports no longer require regular updates, exchanges between involved departments become infrequent, and James Smith's file is no longer included in periodic reviews with expectations of a breakthrough, a change reflecting the assessment that, given the current data, the likelihood of substantial progress is very low. This deprioritization directly results in active investigative activities, already diminished beforehand, virtually halting altogether, no further search operations, no plans to re-interview witnesses, and no efforts to expand hypotheses beyond what has already been considered, leaving the case existing mostly on paper, rather than in practical action. During the reorganization of workloads, the case file is compacted, classified, and placed in storage alongside other unsolved cases, where each document folder represents an unfinished story, preserved but no longer actively processed. This archiving carries more than administrative significance. It marks the transition of the case from a state requiring action to one requiring preservation. Documents related to James Smith, from witness statements, search reports, scene notes, to hypothesis evaluations, are sealed in paper folders, entirely dependent on a manual filing system, where quick retrieval or cross-referencing is limited by the structure of the era's management methods. Parallel to the archiving, a natural yet profound change in personnel occurs. The original investigators, those directly involved in the most critical phases, are gradually reassigned to other duties, or leave the force for personal and professional reasons, taking with them field experience, professional intuition, and unofficial impressions that paper files cannot fully convey. Any successors who access James Smith's file can only work with standardized records, lacking the emotional context, off-the-record exchanges, and unrecorded suspicions, creating a clear gap between the case and those responsible for monitoring it in later stages. The absence of a long-term lead investigator attached to the case means James Smith's file loses its internal advocate, someone who could proactively suggest re-examination, question old assumptions, or push for periodic reviews at appropriate times. Without such a voice in the system, the case gradually blends into the enormous workload of the law enforcement agency, where attention is typically directed toward newer cases or those with higher solvability potential. The inactive status of the case is not recorded in an official document, but is evident in the fact that any new information, if it appears, must meet an extremely high threshold of reliability to trigger any response, and most vague or indirect tips are no longer pursued, not because they lack human value, but because the system no longer has the capacity to allocate resources to low-probability leads. For James's family, this shift is felt clearly even if unspoken contacting authorities becomes more difficult, responses turn increasingly procedural rather than substantive, and conversations gradually revolve around the absence of new information rather than specific action plans, an experience that makes them realize their son's disappearance is no longer under active monitoring. From the system's perspective, moving the case to cold case status is the result of a series of pragmatic choices. Limited resources must be allocated to cases with higher potential for progress, and files like James Smith's, despite their profound human significance, are forced to wait silently until external conditions change. This waiting state creates a difficult paradox. The lack of close monitoring means reduced chances of detecting and utilizing small pieces of information that might emerge randomly over time, making the file less likely to be revisited the longer it sits in storage. In this context, James Smith's disappearance exists as a preserved but non-operational file, an unanswered question retained by the system, but no longer pursued through action, where every recorded detail rests quietly in folders, and hope, if it still exists, is no longer tied to current investigative activities, but to the possibility that one day, factors beyond present control will be strong enough to break the prolonged silence surrounding the name James Smith. The silence enveloping James Smith's file within the investigative system occurs in parallel with a completely separate reality, entirely detached from the archived documents. The child at the center of the disappearance himself was no longer present in Alabama for a very short time after the incident. He left the familiar space of his family and the community where he was born, stepping into an entirely different living environment where every trace connected to his original identity was gradually and thoroughly severed. James's departure from the area did not occur in a way that drew attention or left clear traces. At that time, interstate travel was not tightly controlled. Personal documents for young children were not standardized as they later became, and a 4-year-old child could easily appear elsewhere without triggering any alert system, especially when no one proactively cross-checked or inquired about his origins. When James left Alabama, his living environment changed almost immediately and comprehensively, from the landscape and daily rhythm to the people around him, elements that play a crucial role in shaping childhood memories. This abrupt change took place while he was still too young to understand or consciously remember what had been left behind. No more old house, no more familiar faces, no more familiar family voices. James began to grow up in a new context where his past was never mentioned, never explained, and never linked to any story he could recognize as his own. The new living environment, though stable in daily life, lacked any connection to his early years. Over time, any faint memories that might have remained were gradually overshadowed by new experiences, new habits, and new relationships, a natural process in young children, but one with profound impact on the ability to trace origins later. As James grew up in that setting, questions about the past were rarely raised, not because he actively avoided them, but because the surrounding environment did not encourage or enable inquiry. Everything he knew about himself was shaped entirely by information present in his new life. The lack of clear memories of Alabama or his birth family was not the result of deliberate suppression, but a natural consequence of his very young age at the time of departure, when long-term memory capacity is still limited and easily restructured by later experiences. Any fragmented images, if they existed, were not sharp enough to be recognized as real memories, and were easily blended with imagination or stories heard from others. Over time, they lost significance as signposts back to the past. In the new living environment, James was perceived and treated as an ordinary child with an identity established on the spot, carrying no indicators that he had once been the center of a large-scale search. This very ordinariness meant no one questioned his origins, as there were no sufficiently unusual elements to trigger curiosity or suspicion. Administrative procedures related to him, if carried out, occurred within the loose framework of the era, where document verification was not standardized and inconsistencies were easily overlooked, allowing a new identity to exist without rigorous system checks. During his upbringing, James was never exposed to information indicating he had been reported missing, no markers, no public records in daily life reminding him that he was part of an unsolved case. The absence of this information was not deliberate concealment on his part, but the result of being placed in a context where that past was never brought to light. He had no basis to suspect that the identity he was using was not his original one, as every relationship, every document, and every social experience was consistent with the story he was living. Not knowing he was a missing child meant James had no motivation or reason to search for answers about his early years, and this lack of motivation was reinforced by the fact that his new life did not pose questions forcing him to confront the gap in his past. Minor gaps in personal information, if any, were viewed as normal or unremarkable in the broader social context, where many people have incomplete records or unclear memories of infancy. As James matured in the new environment, the formation of his personal identity occurred based on present experiences rather than what had been severed early on. The absence of a narrated past made his life story coherent in its own way, though objectively, it was a story missing its beginning. The lack of clear memories of his early past also meant James did not carry a sense of loss or doubt about his origins, as feeling loss requires a strong enough memory anchor, and that anchor did not exist in his case. Meanwhile, the geographical distance between his birthplace and his upbringing further reduced the chance of random connections with people or information that could hint at the past. No overlap between the two communities, no shared social networks, and no reason for the story of a missing child in Alabama to reach his new environment. Over time, this separation became so complete that James existed as an individual entirely independent of the cold case file bearing his name, a paradox where the same person was both the center of an unsolved case and an ordinary individual completely unaware of that case's existence. Thus, the victim's departure from Alabama and growth in a different environment was not merely a geographical shift, but a comprehensive reshaping of identity and memory, where the past was closed off without leaving clear signs, and the present was built on a foundation of not knowing. This state appeared normal, but later became the key factor, explaining why James Smith could exist for decades without realizing he had once been the child being searched for, and why the cold case file bearing his name could remain quietly in storage, while he himself was living a completely different life, far from Alabama. The new life established after James left Alabama did not stop at a mere change in living environment, but also entailed a quiet yet decisive legal adjustment process, as the identity he carried in his early years was gradually replaced by a different name, a different record, and a different administrative story that fit the new context into which he was placed. The name change occurred in the loose legal space of that era, where young children had no voice or ability to resist, and assigning him a new name was carried out as a necessary step to integrate into the new living environment without raising questions about the past or attracting unnecessary attention. The new name quickly became the only designation he knew, used in the family, at school, and in social relationships, while the name James Smith, tied to his early years in Alabama, disappeared from his daily life without leaving any identifiable trace. Parallel to the name change was the emergence of a new birth certificate, a foundational document for all subsequent administrative procedures, created to legitimize his existence under the new identity. In a context where the birth registration system was not yet strictly standardized, issuing a birth certificate that did not fully reflect the child's true origin was not impossible. This new birth certificate, although meeting the required formal standards, lacked any connection to the original record in Alabama. It did not accurately record the original place of birth, did not reflect the true circumstances of his birth, and left no trace allowing a trace back to his old identity. The existence of the new birth certificate created a sufficiently solid legal foundation for James, under his new identity, to access social services, education, and healthcare without obstacles, while completely covering the gap caused by the absence of the original record. The lack of an original record was not seen as a serious issue in that context, as many children, especially those transferred to live elsewhere, had incomplete or belatedly supplemented records, and the administrative system of the time had no effective federal cross-checking mechanism to detect inconsistencies between files. It was this lack of interconnection that allowed James's new identity to exist independently, without being scrutinized against lists of missing children or investigation files lying dormant in Alabama's archives. Over time, the deficiencies in the original record not only went undetected, were gradually legitimized through repeated use of the new birth certificate in subsequent procedures, from school enrollment and vaccinations to other civil documents, creating an outwardly consistent chain of documents built on an initially incomplete foundation. Thus, the legal identity James carried became stable in daily life, but stable in an administrative sense rather than a historical one, as it did not fully reflect the truth about his origins. The inconsistency in identity, if viewed from a strictly legal perspective, existed on multiple layers, from the name not matching the actual place of birth to the absence of documents proving his early years. Yet these discrepancies were not prominent enough to trigger deeper scrutiny in a system accustomed to incomplete records. For James himself, the new legal identity did not create a sense of contradiction or unease, as he had no other point of reference for comparison. Every document, every form of address, and every social relationship reinforced the story that this was his real self, and the gaps in the record were simply seen as insignificant details or belonging to a period he could not remember. The absence of the original record also meant that James had no access to information about his early years, but in a social context where personal stories were often passed down through family narratives rather than official documents, that absence did not immediately raise suspicion. The new identity was therefore not just a collection of papers, but also a social construct reinforced by how others perceived and treated him, making the legal inconsistency, though present, invisible in everyday life. However, from a systemic perspective, the parallel existence of these two unconnected identities created a profound paradox. The same individual was recorded as a missing child in Alabama's files, while legally existing under a different identity elsewhere, with no mechanism connecting the two realities. Thus, changing the legal identity was not a single act, but a chain of decisions and conditions that allowed the new identity to completely replace the old one, enabling James to grow up, study, and live as an ordinary individual without ever knowing that the legal foundation of his life was built on a fundamental mismatch. This inconsistency, concealed by valid administrative procedures and the familiarity of daily life, did not cause immediate conflict, but quietly accumulated into a wide gap between the real person and the person recorded on paper, a gap that could only be exposed when a sufficiently strong factor forced the system to compare, cross-check, and question what had long been accepted as self-evident truth. The new legal identity quickly became the sole frame of reference for James's growing up process, shaping how he was perceived, treated, and integrated into the new living environment without revealing any trace of the rupture that had occurred earlier. From that point onward, his childhood unfolded along what seemed like a normal trajectory, built on repeated daily routines, stable relationships, and a family story that was outwardly consistent. In his adoptive family, James was cared for as a child who had belonged there from the beginning. There were no transfer rituals, no complicated explanations about the circumstances of his arrival, only a reality established and consistently maintained that he was a child of the family, a member no different from the others. This very normalcy played a key role in reinforcing his sense of belonging, giving James no reason to doubt or question his place. The adoptive family, whatever their motives, created an environment stable enough for him to develop the necessary emotional bonds, where family roles were clearly defined, daily rules consistently enforced, and stories about the past told only within the framework fitting the new identity, without exposing clear gaps or contradictions. In that context, James gradually formed his earliest memories tied to the new environment, the house, the neighborhood, the school, and the people around him. These memories not only filled, but completely replaced any faint fragments of memory, if any, from his early years in Alabama, turning his original past into a blank space in his awareness. Upon entering school life, the new identity continued to be reinforced through enrollment procedures, class records, and relationships with friends, where James was seen as an ordinary child with a clear name, age, and background as recorded on paper. No element in the school environment forced him to confront questions about his origins or personal history. Daily school activities, from studying and playing to participating in group events, took place in a space where his past was not a topic to be explored, and the absence of information about his infancy was not considered abnormal in the broader social context, where many families did not make a habit of sharing detailed stories about their children's early years. Friendships formed based on present experiences, shared interests, and similar living circumstances, not on stories of origin, and James integrated into this social network without difficulty, as he carried no sign of being different. Throughout his growing up process, not questioning his origins was not the result of deliberate avoidance, but the natural consequence of an environment that did not invite such questions, where every surrounding factor was consistent and no contradiction strong enough to spark doubt. The adoptive family, by maintaining a simple and seamless story about James's presence in the family, inadvertently or intentionally eliminated the need for deeper explanation, and that lack of explanation created no emotional void, as he was never placed in a position of having to compare different narratives. James's maturation therefore occurred in a state of psychological stability, where personal identity was built from present experiences rather than questions about the past. The challenges he faced in childhood were not significantly different from those of other children in the same environment, from academic pressures to social relationships, all within familiar bounds. The absence of clear memories from before leaving Alabama also meant that James did not feel any specific sense of loss, because identifying loss requires a clear memory object, and that object did not exist in his awareness, making the severed past a silent void rather than an open wound. In everyday situations, when other children might hear stories about their birthday or infancy, James did not feel deprived or different, because similar, albeit simple or incomplete, stories in the adoptive family were still sufficient to meet his need for self-identification within the family framework. The lack of an original record or minor inconsistencies in documents did not affect his school or social life, as the system at the time did not emphasize cross-checking personal information, and the smoothness of procedures further reinforced the sense that everything was as it should be. Over time, the new identity was not only accepted but internalized, becoming an inseparable part of how James viewed himself. Every childhood experience, from small joys to early disappointments, was tied to the name and story he had been given, pushing his original past further from the possibility of recognition. In that context, not questioning origins was not a deficiency in awareness, but the logical result of a consistent nurturing process, where the necessary elements to form doubt never converged. James passed through childhood with a complete sense of belonging, unaware that the continuity he experienced was built on a mismatched foundation, a foundation that only an outside perspective could recognize as abnormal, while for him, it was simply the only life he had ever known. The outward continuity of childhood, under the new identity, did not mean that every detail in James's personal record was complete. Parallel to his seemingly normal growing up process, existed a series of small but persistent administrative shortcomings, details not large enough to cause immediate disruption, but sufficient to create silent cracks in his legal and personal identity structure. James's personal record, in many respects, lacked the fullness that a life with a clear starting point typically has, especially documents related to infancy and early years, where information about place of birth, exact time of birth, and initial medical procedures was either inconsistently recorded or existed only as copies without clear origin. These shortcomings were not identified as serious problems in a social context where many families, particularly those with limited means or who had relocated, also possessed incomplete records. The administrative system of that era did not prioritize deep cross-referencing between different data sources. James's date of birth, an information seemingly basic and unambiguous, was one of the most unstable points in his record. Different documents might record the same day, but not the same year, or vice versa, reflecting an administrative compromise rather than a historically accurate fact. This ambiguity did not cause major obstacles in daily life, as school and medical procedures primarily relied on the current birth certificate without requiring comparison to the original record, yet it created a simmering layer of uncertainty, where a key piece of self-information was not firmly anchored to a verifiable event. In some cases, administrative forms required additional information about origin or place of birth, and the answers filled in were often generalized or based on guesswork, not out of intent to conceal, but because no accurate data was available for reference, leading to different documents reflecting slightly varying versions of the same story. Administrative inconsistencies did not appear in clusters or at a specific time, but were scattered over time, dispersed across educational, medical, and civil documents. Each individual discrepancy could be explained as a typo, a harmless mistake, or a consequence of an unstandardized process, and this very dispersion reduced the likelihood of identifying the problem holistically. In the school environment, irregularities in James's personal record were rarely noticed, as schools primarily cared about students' academic performance and behavior, rather than the integrity of administrative documents. When forms were accepted year after year without question, the sense that everything was stable was further reinforced. In interactions with the healthcare system or other social services, similar shortcomings did not lead to deep inquiries, as these agencies operated within a framework of trusting existing documents and had neither the mechanism nor the incentive to trace back the origin of information already legitimized. The parallel existence of partially mismatched information was therefore not seen as a warning sign, but became part of the familiar administrative noise, where minor deviations were accepted as unavoidable in a system that was not yet digitized or interconnected. For James himself, these irregularities were not clear enough to create unease or doubt about his identity, as he accessed information about himself mainly through lived experience and social relationships, rather than by cross-checking records. Any conflicting details that appeared were usually explained simply or dismissed as insignificant technical errors. The lack of a full story about his infancy did not make James feel deprived, because in the family and social environment where he grew up, such stories were not always emphasized, and the absence of information was compensated by current relationships and ongoing experiences. These prolonged irregularities thus existed in a state of suspension, sufficient to create a distance between the real person and the person recorded on paper, but not strong enough to break the continuity of daily life. This suspended state made them dangerous in their own way, because they did not trigger corrective responses, but quietly accumulated over many years. From a systemic perspective, the administrative contradictions related to James reflected a series of small failures in detecting and cross-referencing information, where each agency handled only its own part without a mechanism to see the full picture. When no sufficiently strong point of collision occurred between different systems, the discrepancies were passed from one record to another as verified assumptions. The lack of interconnection between states, levels of government and databases further reduced the chance of discovering that James's current legal identity did not match another existing record elsewhere, especially when that record had been classified as a cold case and was no longer regularly queried. The prolonged signs of irregularity therefore did not manifest as an urgent problem, but as an imperfect background layer, where missing details were accepted because they did not directly hinder the system's functioning or personal life. This acceptance inadvertently reinforced the stability of an identity built on an incomplete foundation. Over many years, these irregularities were overlooked, not because someone deliberately concealed the truth, but because there was no sufficiently strong reason to dig deeper when everything appeared to function normally and produced no immediate consequences. The very normalization of these small shortcomings and contradictions allowed them to persist, becoming an unrecognizable part of the administrative life surrounding James. In hindsight, they appear as early warning signs that were missed, not due to lack of information, but because the information was fragmented, obscured, and placed in a context that did not encourage questioning. In James's reality at the time, these signs carried no particular meaning as he continued to grow, study, and integrate like everyone else, completely unaware that the prolonged incompleteness in his personal record was quietly creating a large gap between the person living and the untold story of his severed early years, a gap that existed silently and persistently, waiting for a sufficiently powerful external force to compel both the system and the individual to re-examine what had long been taken for granted. The shortcomings and simmering inconsistencies in James's personal file did not hinder the most significant transition in a person's life, when he left childhood behind and entered adulthood with a fully socially recognized identity, where his new legal identity was no longer merely a means of integration, but became the foundation for all major decisions in his life. James grew up within the familiar expectations of his surroundings, completed his education, entered the workforce, and built a life based on stability, rather than questioning the past, because every indication showed that the path ahead depended on what he did in the present, rather than on what had happened before he was old enough to remember. Starting a family occurred as a natural development, welcomed by society and those around him as an inevitable part of the life cycle, and during that process, the identity James carried was never met with special scrutiny or questioning, as all related procedures relied on the existing file that had been used for many years without issue. His own family was built on familiar values, where James's role was clearly defined as a husband and father, and his personal past, if mentioned at all, existed only in simplified stories that contained no gaps or contradictions large enough to cause disruption. When he had children, James entered a new phase of life, where responsibility for the next generation took up all his attention, and the presence of grandchildren further reinforced the sense that his life had been built in a logical sequence, with a beginning, development, and continuation like any other family. In his role as a father, James had no reason to doubt his own origins, because questions about background, if any, were usually raised only in exceptional circumstances or when clear instability appeared, something that did not occur in the life he was living. James's adult life was characterized by relative stability, not wealth or prominence, but the regularity of work, social relationships, and daily routines, where the main challenges came from economic pressures, family responsibilities, and the ordinary fluctuations of life, rather than from fundamental questions about himself. Key milestones such as employment, residence, social connections, and community standing were all established based on the identity he had used since childhood, and nothing in these interactions suggested that this identity might not match his true history. The pre-existing administrative irregularities continued to be covered up by the smooth functioning of adult life, as all necessary legal procedures could be completed using the existing documents, and the incompleteness of the original file did not create any direct obstacle large enough to require investigation. In the eyes of his own family and the surrounding community, James was an individual with a clear history, someone who grew up, started a family, and raised children in the familiar way. And this perception itself helped reinforce the narrative that there was nothing that needed to be questioned. The lack of knowledge about his hidden past did not stem from indifference or avoidance, but from the absence of any strong signal to trigger curiosity or suspicion, because everything in James's life was consistent with the story he was living. Any gaps in memory from early childhood, if noticed, were typically explained by common reasons such as childhood memories being unclear, or the family not keeping many mementos, explanations plausible enough to quell the need for deeper digging. In social relationships, James was never placed in situations that required him to provide details about his origins or personal history beyond basic information, and the absence of such questions allowed his life story to continue without resistance. Over the years, James's adult identity was built on accumulated experiences, responsibilities, and relationships, making the distant past, if it had ever existed as a different story, increasingly irrelevant to how he saw himself. To his descendants, he was a grandfather and father, with a history tied to what they witnessed and were told, not to the years that had been severed before he could tell his own story. And this generational continuity further blurred the possibility that his life had once begun somewhere else, under a different name. Throughout his adulthood, James lived in an invisible paradox. On one hand, he existed as a complete individual with a clear past, present and future in social life. On the other, the same person existed as an unresolved file in the law enforcement system of a state he no longer remembered. But these two realities never intersected, because there was no information bridge or circumstance that forced them to confront each other. This absolute separation allowed James to build and maintain a stable life for decades, without ever knowing that his past had been hidden, not as an actively protected secret, but as a void that had been perfectly covered over by time, circumstances, and the normal functioning of life, to the point that even he had no reason to suspect that the story he was living was merely the continuation of a narrative that had been broken off very early. The stable life James had built over decades existed in parallel with a quiet but revolutionary change in American society at large: the emergence and gradual popularization of DNA genealogy technology. Initially approached as a personal tool for exploring ancestral origins, over time it became an enormous biological data repository with the ability to connect people beyond the limits of memory, paperwork, and geographic distance. DNA genealogy did not enter James's life through a sudden or coercive event, but seeped in through broader cultural shifts, as more and more Americans took DNA tests to discover family lineages, confirm blood relations, or simply satisfy curiosity about family history. The normalization of this practice created a data foundation that had not existed in previous decades. In that context, a relative of James, motivated not by any specific suspicion about his identity, but by a personal interest in exploring ancestry, decided to take a DNA test through a popular commercial service. What seemed like an insignificant decision, limited to a small family circle, turned out to have far-reaching consequences beyond what the participant could have imagined. The DNA sample was collected, processed, and converted into digital data, then uploaded into an automated comparison system where millions of other profiles existed side by side, ready to be matched for genetic similarities. This process occurred completely separately from traditional investigative systems, unrelated to police or law enforcement agencies, and this independence allowed it to grow rapidly, with fewer legal and administrative constraints that had once prevented large-scale identity cross-referencing. When James's relatives' DNA data entered the system, it became part of an ever-expanding biological network, where each new profile increased the potential for cross-connections between individuals who had no knowledge of each other's existence. Within that network, comparison algorithms began performing work that humans could not have done for decades, scanning genetic similarities across state lines, and even beyond. Initial results were not immediately conclusive, as these systems typically only provide probabilistic matches, but those primary connections were sufficient to reveal that within the genetic family tree being built, there existed an unexplained branch. Blood relationship indicators showed a connection that could not be explained by existing family information, creating a scientific anomaly, rather than an administrative one, because DNA does not depend on paperwork or recounted stories, but directly reflects biological links. This initial blood connection did not immediately lead to a clear conclusion, but it served as a warning signal that there was an unfilled gap in the family history, one that could not be explained by familiar assumptions, such as clerical errors or missing information. For the relative who took the test, this result was initially received as a curiosity, a question requiring more data to clarify, rather than a shocking discovery, because in the context of widespread DNA genealogy, unexpected matches were not uncommon. However, the very existence of this connection, however vague, was recorded in the system, and became a node in the data network that could be activated when additional compatible profiles appeared. DNA data does not stand still, it is continuously compared, updated and re-evaluated as new participants join the system, and over time, the accuracy of potential matches increases as the number of reference samples grows. In this context, DNA genealogy began to move beyond its original role as a personal tool and became a means of restructuring family relationships on a large scale, where stories broken by time, migration or past personal decisions could be reconnected through pure biological data. Importantly, this process occurred entirely independently of James's awareness, as he continued his daily life, without knowing that at another data layer, his existence was gradually being linked to a broader biological network, where algorithms cared nothing about life stories or legal identities, but only saw matching DNA sequences. The emergence of this technology shifted the balance between what can be known and what is forgotten, because for the first time, human memory and administrative records were no longer absolute barriers to determining origins, and cases once frozen due to lack of clues now had an entirely new avenue of approach. However, at this stage, DNA technology still existed only as an unrealized potential, because the initial matches, though scientifically significant, were not yet clear enough to tell a complete story on their own, and required more data and comparisons to move beyond speculation. This gradual accumulation created a unique state of waiting, where biological puzzle pieces quietly found each other in the system, without direct intervention from those involved. In this broader picture, James remained an ordinary individual living his life, while at another layer of reality, the biological truth about his origins began to be revealed, not through memory or storytelling, but through data sequences analyzed by machines. The separation between these two layers highlighted the special role of DNA genealogy technology, its ability to connect people who had never sought each other, opening the possibility that stories buried by time and silence could be brought back to light, not through personal effort, but through the relentless operation of an increasingly sophisticated biological data system. The initial genetic signals recorded in the DNA genealogy system did not remain at the level of vague suggestions. Over time, as the number of test participants increased and data was continuously updated, comparison algorithms began producing partial matches with steadily increasing reliability, sufficient to rule out the possibility that they were mere random coincidences or technical errors. Matching DNA segments appeared repeatedly across multiple different profiles, demonstrating an undeniable blood relationship between individuals who had never met or had any social connection in everyday life. This systematic repetition made the results appear as a real genetic structure waiting to be decoded. The fact that the matches were only partial, rather than direct, was especially significant, as it indicated that the central individual in the relationship was not among those who had taken the test, but existed as a missing link, a person yet unidentified, but who had left a clear biological imprint in subsequent generations. When these results were aggregated and compared, they formed a consistent data cluster, where the estimated degree of relationship was close enough to rule out distant ancestry, but could not be explained by any individual recorded in existing family trees. This gap became the largest anomaly, because in most DNA genealogy cases, such matches could ultimately be linked to a specific person in the family history, but here every attempt to cross-reference with familiar names yielded no results. To clarify this gap, a systematic narrowing of family lines was undertaken, combining DNA data with traditional sources such as family records, civil documents, local historical materials, and manually constructed family trees, a process requiring patience and high logical rigor, as each genetic link had to be placed in the correct temporal and geographic context to avoid emotional inferences. Family branches were analyzed one by one, incompatible possibilities eliminated based on age, geographic location, and degree of DNA match, gradually narrowing the search to a few family lines with the most fitting genetic characteristics. During this process, a pattern began to emerge, showing that the missing individual in the family tree most likely belonged to a specific generation, young enough to still be alive and close enough in blood relation to explain the existing matches. When the genetic data was placed alongside the migration history of the related families, a common point became increasingly clear: a connection to a specific geographic area in the southern United States, where many branches in the matching cluster had lived or originated. Alabama emerged as a recurring convergence point in the compared ancestral records. This link to Alabama did not stem from emotional assumption, but from the repeated appearance of geographic data across multiple sources, from birthplaces recorded in old documents to residential addresses in civil records, forming a pattern too consistent to ignore. Once Alabama was identified as a key marker, analysts began asking whether the genetic gap being sought might be tied to a specific event in that area, rather than just ordinary migration or a family record error. Cross-referencing this data with local history and recorded events opened a new possibility. Alabama had once been home to unresolved missing children cases where identities were disrupted and never reconnected in traditional family documents. The intersection of DNA data and geographic context made the hypothesis that the central individual in the matches might be linked to a disappearance case more plausible, as it explained both the person's absence from the family tree and the continued appearance of biological links in later generations. From this point, the suspicion that this individual might still be alive began to form seriously, not based on subjective hope, but on data logic, because if the person had died very early without descendants, the current matches would be unlikely to exist with their observed degree and structure. Considering the estimated age of the central individual, based on genetic relationships and the ages of test participants, further reinforced the likelihood that this was someone who had lived long enough to have descendants, and thus could not simply be classified among unrecorded early deaths. This suspicion, though unconfirmed, was strong enough to completely change how the analyzed DNA data was viewed, shifting the focus from searching for a name in the past to the possibility of identifying a living person in the present, a decisive perceptual leap. Nevertheless, caution remained paramount, because DNA genealogy provides connections and probabilities, but does not directly identify identity or life circumstances, and linking a specific person to a historical case requires multiple layers of verification beyond pure biological data. Analysts were well aware that without tight control over the inference process, the risk of error or misattribution was very high, especially as DNA data grew richer, but was not always correctly interpreted in context. Still, the convergence of factors from systematic partial matches and successful family line, narrowing to the increasingly clear geographic link to Alabama, created a sufficiently solid foundation to raise the core question that had never before been seriously considered: whether the victim of a disappearance from decades ago could have lived an entire life without ever knowing their original identity. This suspicion was not only personally significant for those connected to the DNA data, but also had the potential to change the perspective on a case once considered unsolvable, suggesting that a historical gap did not necessarily mean death or permanent disappearance, but could result from a prolonged identity disruption. In this state, DNA data was no longer simply a tool for tracing ancestry, but became the key to resetting the entire question of the central individual's fate, and the suspicion that the victim was still alive, though unverified, was powerful enough to shake long-accepted assumptions and create a major perceptual turning point in approaching a story forgotten for decades. The suspicion that the victim might still be alive, formed from the convergence of DNA data and geographic indicators linked to Alabama, created sufficient pressure for the James Smith file to no longer remain in passive storage, and it was at this point that the case shifted from a state of silence into a new investigative space where modern methods could directly engage with questions the old system had never been able to resolve. The Cold Case Unit took on the file in the context of recognizing that this was not merely a long-standing missing person case, but one with the potential to connect contemporary biological data with fragmented historical records, a rare combination justifying the reallocation of resources. Acceptance of the case was not a mere formality, but came with a comprehensive re-evaluation of the file's value, from the integrity of archived documents to the case's compatibility with reopening criteria, with DNA playing a central role as an objective data source, transcending the limits of human testimony and memory. As the file returned to active review, investigators began re-examining every old document, not to hunt for a single overlooked detail, but to restructure the entire narrative in a way that had never been done before, placing crime scene reports, witness statements, and investigative hypotheses within the same analytical framework as the new data. This process revealed the extent of the old file's fragmentation, where documents created in different eras reflected the assumptions and limitations of their time, from a lack of standardized record-keeping to heavy reliance on subjective accounts, factors that had once made cross-referencing difficult. When modern investigators approached the file, they did not merely reread the content, but evaluated how the information had been collected, stored, and interpreted to identify points where older methods may have overlooked or been incapable of handling. Alongside revisiting the old file, the new DNA data was introduced as a central reference axis, allowing investigators to ask questions previously impossible, such as whether timelines in the old file aligned with inferences about age and biological relationships suggested by the genetic data. Comparing new and old data did not aim for perfect matches, but focused on identifying meaningful intersections, where historical information could be reinterpreted in light of what the DNA indicated. During this process, certain details previously deemed insufficiently valuable for pursuit in the initial investigation began to be seen anew as potential puzzle pieces, not because they had changed, but because the analytical context had shifted, allowing them to fit into a broader story. Investigators realized that many assumptions in the old file, such as the likelihood of the victim's early death, or the lack of connections beyond the initial search area, had been formed under conditions lacking objective data, and having DNA indicators forced them to seriously reconsider those assumptions. The cross-referencing also exposed clear gaps in the old file, where missing or inconsistent information was not an exception but a common feature, reflecting systemic limitations of investigations from that era. As data layers were stacked, certain key timelines began to be re-evaluated, not to reconstruct every hour and minute precisely, but to determine whether new hypotheses could reasonably exist within the recorded time frame. It was here that investigators gradually identified critical pivot points, intersections where biological, geographic and historical data converged strongly enough to redirect the entire case. These pivot points were not single details, but the realization that the James Smith file contained elements, allowing the assumption that the victim had been taken out of the locality and lived under another identity. An idea once considered too far-fetched in the original investigation, but now plausible when illuminated by DNA. Identifying this pivot point did not mean solving the case, but it created a new logical axis, enabling the cold case unit to rebuild its approach strategy based on tracing connections between the current legal identity of an unidentified individual and the historical missing person file in Alabama. From a professional perspective, reopening the file marked a significant shift from passive reaction to proactive questioning, where new data not only supplemented the old file, but forced the system to confront its own past limitations. The cold case unit's acceptance and restructuring of the file also meant that the case was no longer viewed as a story closed by silence, but as an open problem where modern methods could create connections previously unimaginable. In that context, the James Smith file became a textbook example of how a case seemingly buried by time could be brought back into the light when biological data and new investigative thinking converged, and identifying those pivot points in the relationship between past and present laid the foundation for the next steps, where questions about the victim's identity and fate were no longer beyond the system's reach, but became specific investigative targets, guided by logic and evidence rather than assumptions and speculation. The pivot points established during the reopening process paved the way for the investigation to enter a decisive phase, where every assumption had to be verified by concrete evidence and every doubt resolved through formal confirmation procedures, with the centerpiece being the completion of DNA testing to transform probabilistic biological connections into scientifically irrefutable affirmations. Additional DNA samples were collected from the closest blood relatives in the identified family line, with strict consent and oversight to ensure the process's legality and reliability. When these samples were entered into the comparison system, the degree of match increased markedly, surpassing the threshold required to confirm a direct relationship, rather than merely a partial match speculation. The test results showed a consistent genetic structure, with sufficiently long and distinctive matching segments to determine that the central individual in the biological connections was James Smith, the child who went missing in Alabama decades earlier, and this consistency was verified through multiple independent cross-checks to rule out error or random coincidence. Completing the DNA testing not only held scientific significance, but also established a legal foundation for subsequent verification steps. As in the modern justice system, DNA is considered high-value evidence, sufficient to support official file adjustments and updates. Alongside the testing process, investigators compared legal documents related to James's current identity, including a birth certificate issued after he left Alabama, school records, civil documents, and other papers reflecting his legal existence under a different name. To assess consistency and discrepancies with the original file, this comparison revealed a chain of formally valid documents, but lacking links to the original origin, precisely reflecting what the DNA data had suggested, that the current legal identity was built on a foundation not matching the true biological history. Investigators found no evidence that James had ever been recorded as deceased or removed from the system through any legal procedure, a key finding that ruled out the possibility that the missing person file had been resolved without full update, while reinforcing that the case had stalled not due to an implicit conclusion, but due to a lack of tools to reach one. When DNA data and legal records were placed side by side, a clear picture began to emerge, with each type of evidence supporting rather than contradicting the other, showing that James Smith had lived an entire life under another identity, without any official intervention connecting the two realities. Updating the victim's file became an unavoidable step in this context, as the cold case unit proceeded to change the case status from missing fate unknown to victim confirmed alive, a historic change for a file that had been shelved in silence for decades. Information about James was updated to reflect his current status, including recording that the victim had been positively identified, was no longer missing, and that the initial loss of contact had not led to death as previously feared, an adjustment that was not merely technical but carried profound symbolic meaning. Throughout this process, investigators handled the overlap between the two file sets carefully, ensuring that updates did not disrupt or negate the legality of the identity James had used for many years, as the goal of confirmation was not to erase the life he had lived, but to connect it to the overlooked biological and historical truth. Confirmation that James Smith was alive was carried out through a series of independent verification steps, including comparison of biological data, cross-checking of legal information, and validation via traditional investigative methods, ensuring the final conclusion rested not on a single source, but on converging evidence. For the law enforcement system, this was a rare moment when a cold case did not end with identifying a perpetrator or recovering remains, but with affirming the victim's existence, a result both positive and posing new challenges regarding the handling of a truth delayed for too long. This confirmation also forced relevant agencies to re-examine how missing persons files were managed in the past, as the fact that a child could disappear from the system for decades without detection revealed serious structural gaps in data connectivity and cross-referencing capabilities of that era. From a legal standpoint, confirming James Smith's survival did not immediately trigger criminal consequences, but it required adjustments in national and state databases to ensure consistent updated information and prevent future confusion or duplication. For the cold case unit, completing identity confirmation marked the end of an investigative phase focused on who and whether or not, shifting the focus from seeking existence to understanding the context of that existence, though at this stage, all actions remained within the framework of confirmation and file updating. Confirming James Smith was alive not only resolved a question spanning decades, but fundamentally changed the perspective on the case, transforming a file once seen as a symbol of loss into proof of modern technology's power to reconnect stories, thought permanently severed. In the moment the final confirmation was recorded, the James Smith file was no longer a set of documents awaiting storage, but a complete identity narrative where biological data, legal papers, and modern investigative work converged to affirm a simple yet profoundly weighty truth. The child who went missing long ago did not merely exist in memory and files, but had lived, grown, and existed beyond the system's view for decades. And now, for the first time, that existence was officially acknowledged and recorded in the case history. The official confirmation of James Smith's identity did not close the remaining questions, but instead opened a new retrospective investigative phase, where the focus shifted from where is the victim now, to how could a 4-year-old child leave Alabama, vanish from the system, and live under another identity for decades, without leaving clear traces. Investigators began analyzing plausible scenarios based on all confirmed data, combining historical records, the social context of the time, and the practical limitations of population management systems, to reconstruct the most reasonable sequence of events possible, while acknowledging that reconstructing every detail precisely was impossible. The focus of the analysis was not to create a perfect story, but to identify logical paths James could have taken, eliminate implausible options, and narrow remaining scenarios to logically acceptable levels. Among the scenarios considered, the possibility that James was deliberately taken by an individual or group emerged as the central analytical direction, as moving across multiple states, changing identity, and establishing a new life required a level of intent beyond what a random accident or ordinary wandering could account for. Analyzing potential travel routes became a key part of the process, with investigators comparing feasible transportation corridors existing at the time James disappeared, with later locations linked to his new identity, to identify the most reasonable migration corridors. Interstate and state highways of that era, though less strictly controlled than today, still followed major transportation axes, and a child being taken out of Alabama would most likely have followed these routes, especially if the persons involved aimed to leave the area quickly and with minimal attention. When potential destinations were mapped, certain travel paths appeared more logical than others based on distance, time, and accessibility, allowing investigators to build realistic movement scenarios even if specific legs could not be confirmed. Alongside route analysis, the roles of involved individuals were re-examined, not to assign criminal responsibility immediately, but to understand relationships and opportunities that existed at the time of James's disappearance. Investigators reviewed those who could have had access to James during the critical time frame, individuals with motive or circumstances sufficient to remove a child from the locality, and those capable of maintaining silence or concealing actions within a poorly connected system. This analysis faced significant challenges, as most people directly or indirectly involved at the time were deceased, or if still alive, had memories faded by time, making direct testimony nearly impossible to obtain. In that context, investigators had to rely more heavily on logical inference and indirect data, rather than direct evidence, to assess each individual's potential role in the constructed scenarios. A factor carefully considered was the possibility that James was taken under the guise of informal care, or unofficial guardianship, a not uncommon reality in the social context of that era, where adoption and child transfer procedures were not tightly regulated, and the line between humanitarian action and illegal conduct could be blurred by circumstances. This scenario explained how James could quickly integrate into a new living environment and obtain replacement legal documents, while raising questions about the awareness and responsibility of those involved. However, pinpointing exactly who played the central role in taking James remained beyond the current investigation's reach, as every hypothesis encountered the major limitation of lacking direct evidence. Documents that might once have existed, if any, were not preserved, or had been lost over time, and the administrative system of that period left no clear trail to trace back personal decisions. Investigators recognized that tracing the process of being taken away could never achieve absolute certainty, as each scenario relied on a combination of surviving data and unfillable gaps, and their task was not to create a complete story at all costs, but to determine what could be proven and what had to be accepted as unresolvable. Evidentiary limitations dominated this entire retrospective investigative phase, as every verification effort was constrained by the passage of time, the loss of witnesses, and the absence of interconnected records. Investigators had to confront the reality that many questions would never have definitive answers, not due to lack of effort, but because the system and circumstances of the past had not left the necessary traces for later pursuit. Nevertheless, analyzing plausible scenarios remained meaningful, as it allowed the case to be placed in a reasonable framework of understanding, where what happened was viewed as the result of specific social, legal, and personal conditions, rather than an inexplicable, mysterious disappearance. This process also clarified the boundary between what could be investigated and what had to be accepted as the inaccessible part of the case's history, a necessary demarcation to avoid pursuing untestable hypotheses. While tracing the process of being taken away did not yield specific names or clear incriminating evidence, it provided a deeper understanding of how a child could fall out of the protection system and exist beyond the view of authorities for decades, thereby highlighting structural vulnerabilities of the era. For the investigation, This phase was not an attempt to close every question but a necessary step to define the limits of reconstructible truth, and in acknowledging those limits, the James Smith file was placed in a fuller context, where his existence was confirmed. The path he traveled was outlined at the most reasonable level possible, and the remaining gaps were recorded as inseparable parts of a case eroded by time and circumstance to the point where full recovery was impossible. Tracing James's journey to its limits closes one chapter of retrospective investigation while opening an entirely different phase in nature, where the focus shifts from hypotheses and scenarios to the real people at either end of a time gap spanning nearly a lifetime. Once James Smith's identity was officially confirmed, the next step moved beyond data analysis or archived records to contacting his biological family, a task that was both administrative and profoundly emotional, as any approach had to carefully consider the psychological impact on everyone involved. Contact was not made abruptly or directly, but through specialized intermediary channels, with the goal of ensuring the information was conveyed in a controlled, clear, and respectful manner to avoid shock or unrealistic expectations. James's biological family, who had lived for decades with an unanswered question, received the news in a state of both disbelief and caution, because memories of a 4-year-old child who vanished could not easily connect to the image of a fully grown man who had lived an entire life elsewhere. Preparation for an in-person meeting took place with consultation from psychologists and experts experienced in late reunions to minimize the risk of emotional harm and to help all parties understand that the meeting could not immediately restore what was lost, but could only open a new space for recognition and connection. When the actual in-person meeting finally occurred, it lacked the dramatic or explosive emotional quality often imagined. Instead, it unfolded in an atmosphere of caution, where every gesture and glance carried the weight of time gone by. James, who had lived nearly his entire life under a different identity, entered the encounter knowing that the people before him were not vivid memories in his mind, but individuals tied to a story he was only beginning to understand. While his biological family had to face the reality that the child they had searched for was now a stranger in appearance, voice, and life experience. The meeting did not immediately erase the strangeness, but it created a real point of intersection between two life stories that had developed independently for decades, allowing both sides to confirm each other's existence, not merely through files or DNA data, but through physical presence and direct interaction. In that process, establishing a new relationship became a complex challenge, because blood ties confirmed by science do not automatically translate into emotional or social familiarity, and both James and his biological family had to redefine their roles in each other's lives. James could not return to being the 4-year-old child of the past, nor could his biological family remain in the position of those still searching, so any new relationship, if it could form, had to be built on the foundation of the present, with respect for the fully lived lives on both sides. Initial conversations focused on sharing basic information about their past lives, not to compensate or compare, but to create a shared picture of what each side had experienced during the years of separation, thereby reducing the sense of emptiness caused by not knowing each other. In this process, differences in family culture, daily habits, and worldview became clear, reflecting the reality that James had been shaped by an entirely different environment, and those differences were not something to erase, but an inseparable part of who he was now. The unbridgeable gap of time existed in every small detail, from unshared memories to major life milestones that had passed without the other side's presence, and acknowledging that gap was a necessary condition to avoid unrealistic expectations of a complete return. His biological family had to confront regret over the lost years, moments that could never be reclaimed, such as James's childhood, coming of age, or starting a family, while James had to navigate the conflicting feelings of knowing he belonged to a biological family and having built an independent identity, not based on that connection. Thus, the reunion did not mean closing a perfect circle, but opening a new form of relationship, where the truth was acknowledged but the flow of time could not be reversed. In subsequent meetings, if any, the relationship between James and his biological family took shape gradually through real interaction rather than romantic expectations, with both sides learning to set appropriate boundaries, respect each other's emotional pace, and accept that closeness, if it could form, required time and could not be forced. Establishing this new relationship was not only a matter between James and his biological family, but also involved the separate family he had built, who also had to adjust to the emergence of a part of his history they had never known, creating a complex web of relationships that demanded careful consideration and communication. In that context, reunion was understood not as a traditional happy ending, but as a pivotal life turning point, where the truth finally came to light, but simultaneously posed new challenges about how to live with that truth. The unbridgeable gap of time was not seen as a failure of the reunion, but as a reality that needed acknowledgement to avoid imposing unattainable expectations, and that very acknowledgement allowed both sides to find a form of connection suited to the present circumstances. For James, the reunion brought informational completeness, helping him understand his biological origins and place his personal experiences in a broader context, though it did not fundamentally change who he had become. For his biological family, meeting James alive brought a form of closure they once thought impossible, though that closure did not erase the pain of decades of fruitless searching, but transformed it into part of a now connected story. Overall, the reunion process was not the conclusion of the case, but an important transitional phase, where justice took the form of confirmed truth, but the meaning of that truth had to be interpreted and integrated into each individual's life in their own way. The meeting between James and his biological family, though unable to make up for what was lost, marked a rare moment when a decades-long void was filled by real presence, and in that presence, the story of a missing child no longer existed only in files or memories, but became a living part of the present, with all the complexity, fragility, and limitations time had left behind. The meeting after decades of separation did not immediately close the story with a new state of balance, but opened a prolonged phase of quiet adjustments, where long-term psychological impacts gradually emerged in a subtle yet persistent way, affecting both James and the biological relatives who had just reconnected. For James, learning the truth about his origins did not produce a single shock followed by resolution, but triggered a prolonged chain of psychological responses where lifelong built memories had to coexist with a new narrative about himself, a narrative that did not replace what he had lived, but forced him to redefine how he understood his past. Questions that had never existed before arose naturally, not as dramatic torment, but as quiet reflections on how he had become the person he was in a different circumstance, and whether his current choices, personality, and relationships had been shaped in any way by the initial disruption he had been unaware of. James's biological family underwent a similar but opposite psychological adjustment process, where the relief of knowing their child was alive had to coexist with regret over the lost years, a regret that could not be resolved simply by meeting again. Because time had created different people with separate lives, these conflicting emotions did not emerge all at once, but appeared in waves, as initial excitement gradually gave way to clearer awareness of the limits of what could be repaired. And it was in this phase that both sides had to learn to accept that reunion did not mean erasing trauma, but only changing its form of existence. Adjusting family relationships became a process requiring patience and flexibility, as James and his biological family had to jointly determine appropriate boundaries for the newly forming relationship, avoiding the imposition of traditional roles that were no longer fitting after decades apart. James could not return to being the child in the old family structure in the full sense, nor could his biological family demand the same level of attachment as relationships nurtured continuously throughout his life, and acknowledging this, though difficult, was necessary to avoid unnecessary disappointment. Alongside this, The separate family James had built also had to participate in the adjustment process, as the emergence of his biological family created a new layer of relationships, requiring balance between respecting the newly discovered past and protecting the stability of existing bonds. Discussions about roles, levels of connection, and ways to maintain contact took place in a context without precedent, as each side had to find the most suitable way to coexist with the new truth without harming the family structure already formed. In addition to emotional and relational adjustments, legal issues began to be addressed, not as heated disputes, but as inevitable consequences of two parallel identities, now officially linked. Updating civil records, correcting missing person information in databases, and clarifying potential legal ramifications of James having been considered missing for decades, required coordination among multiple agencies, and caution to avoid unnecessary disruption to his current life. Questions about rights, obligations, and legal responsibilities were raised, not to reverse the past, but to ensure that identity confirmation did not create unintended consequences, especially since James had lived a legally valid life under another identity for decades. Relevant agencies had to balance recognizing historical truth with protecting the legal stability of an individual who had built his life within the existing system, a balance that was not simple but necessary to prevent the discovered truth from becoming a new source of instability. In this process, the limits of reunion became increasingly clear, not as a failure, but as an unavoidable reality of late reunions after long separation. Not every question could be answered, not every gap could be filled, and not every relationship could reach the desired level of closeness, despite blood confirmation and good intentions. Acknowledging these limits helped reduce pressure to achieve a perfect outcome, allowing both sides to accept the relationship in the healthiest form possible in the present. For James, post-reunion was the phase of learning to integrate the new truth into his personal identity without letting it deny or overshadow the life he had lived, a process requiring self-reflection, but also bringing a greater sense of cognitive completeness, as questions about origins were no longer left open. For his biological family, it was the transition from the role of searchers to connectors, a difficult but necessary shift to avoid continuing to live in the past. Overall, post-reunion did not resemble a traditional neat ending, but a prolonged phase of adaptation, where truth was accepted, emotions were processed gradually, and relationships were reshaped according to present realities. It was in this phase that the true meaning of finding a living victim emerged, not only in answering the case question, but in how those involved learned to continue living with that answer, accepting that reunion could bring informational closure, but could never fully erase what time had taken away. As psychological, relational, and legal adjustments after reunion gradually stabilized, the remaining question of the case emerged more clearly than ever, not about who James Smith was, or whether he was alive, but whether it was possible to identify who had taken him from Alabama, and how that action had occurred without being stopped. The cold case unit approached the assessment of identifying a perpetrator with extreme caution, as investigators had been aware from the beginning that this was the most difficult part, not only because so much time had passed, but because the nature of the case lay in a historical period where removing a child, though illegal by modern standards, often occurred in a gray area between law, social custom, and personal circumstance. The plausible scenarios constructed during the tracing phase were re-examined from the perspective of individual responsibility, but each scenario encountered the same fundamental limit: no direct evidence strong enough to link a specific act to a specific individual under criminal prosecution standards. Identifying a perpetrator required not only logical reasoning, but a continuous chain of evidence, proving conduct, motive, and direct connection to the victim at the critical moment, elements that had almost entirely vanished from the records after decades. When investigators reviewed the list of those who could have had access to James during his disappearance, they found that most such individuals had passed away, taking with them memories, motives, and any unrecorded truths. The loss of this witness generation was not limited to those potentially directly involved, but also included indirect witnesses, people who lived in the community at the time and might have observed, heard, or suspected something but did not report it, or were not officially recorded. The passing of this generation created an irreplaceable void, as no modern investigative method could fully replace direct testimony, especially in cases where physical evidence was already scarce from the start. Even when some related individuals were still alive, their memories, if they still existed, had been eroded by time, influenced by repeatedly retold stories, or unconsciously restructured to fit current perceptions, making the reliability of any late testimony a major issue. In that context, the lack of grounds for prosecution became clear not as a failure of the current investigation, but as an inevitable consequence of initial conditions that had not allowed a solid criminal file to be built. With no preserved crime scene, no traceable physical evidence, no official travel records, and no sufficiently strong direct testimony, every assumption about a perpetrator, no matter how reasonable, could not cross the legal threshold required for prosecution or charges. Investigators were forced to confront the reality that criminal justice standards could not be lowered merely to satisfy the need for closure, as prosecuting, without sufficient grounds, would not only violate the rule of law, but also risk creating new injustice by assigning responsibility to someone without enough evidence to defend themselves. During this evaluation, the Cold Case Unit also considered the possibility that taking James, though causing severe family and psychological harm, might not have been carried out with criminal intent, as understood today, but within a social context where taking to raise or informal caregiving occurred unofficially and without strict oversight. This scenario, while not diminishing the gravity of severing James from his biological family, blurred the line between deliberate criminal behavior and wrongful action in a loose system, making criminal identification even more difficult. As every investigative avenue was weighed and sequentially eliminated from prosecution potential, the case reached a distinctive stopping point. Biological and historical truth had been clarified to the maximum extent possible, but individual responsibility could not be legally attached. Acknowledging that the case could not be completed in the traditional sense of criminal justice was a heavy decision, not only for the investigative system, but also for James's biological family, who might have expected a clear answer about who caused decades of loss. However, continuing to pursue a criminal conclusion without solid grounds was seen as dishonest to the very goal of justice, because justice lies not only in pointing to someone to hold accountable, but also in recognizing the limits of what can be proven. Thus, the James Smith case fell into a unique state. The core truth was confirmed, the victim was found and reunited, but the question of the perpetrator remained an unfillable void, not due to lack of effort, but because time, circumstances, and gaps in the past had erased the path to that answer. This void was not viewed as total failure, but as a reminder of the long-term consequences of delayed action, inadequate record-keeping, and lack of effective protection mechanisms in certain historical periods. When the Cold Case Unit officially recorded that there was insufficient evidence to identify and prosecute a perpetrator, the case file was updated with necessary honesty, reflecting that this was a matter resolved regarding the victim's identity and fate, but never, and perhaps never, fully resolved regarding criminal responsibility. For James, the absence of a specific perpetrator did not diminish the value of knowing who he was and where he came from, but it set a clear limit on seeking traditional closure, forcing him and his biological family to accept that part of the story would forever remain out of reach. For the investigative system, the case became a textbook example of situations where modern technology could illuminate biological truth and identity, but could not reverse losses of evidence and witnesses caused by time. In that state, the James Smith case did not end by bringing someone to trial, but by frankly acknowledging that justice, in some cases, cannot reach its most complete form, and accepting that void, however difficult, is a necessary step to close the file honestly and responsibly. Acknowledging that the case could not be completed in the sense of criminal prosecution closes the specific investigative process, while opening a broader space for evaluating the significance of the James Smith case for the U.S. cold case system, where this matter became a rare demonstration of the ability to resolve a victim's fate, even when the full chain of past responsibility could not be restored. In the broader picture of cold cases, James Smith represents a different path from the familiar outcomes of many such cases. Instead of ending with confirmation of death or recovery of remains, this file concluded with confirmation that the victim had lived, grown up, and existed outside the system's view for decades. This forces investigators and the public to adjust their understanding of what solving a case means, as discovering the truth about a person's fate can carry equal or even greater significance than identifying a perpetrator in cases where time has eliminated prosecution possibilities. The case's impact on the U.S. cold case field is clear in showing that even files thought to be completely deadlocked can be reactivated if a sufficiently powerful new data type emerges to break the loop of old assumptions, and in this instance, that data was DNA genealogy. The role of DNA genealogy lies not only in providing a technical tool, but in transforming the perceptual foundation of modern investigation. Identity no longer depends entirely on documents, memories, or testimony, but can be traced directly from biological traces that transcend administrative and geographic barriers. The James Smith case demonstrates DNA genealogy's ability to connect people unaware of each other's existence, restructure broken family ties, and raise questions the traditional system could not envision, especially in child abduction cases from historical periods with lax population management. However, the case also reveals clear limits of this technology. DNA can confirm identity and blood relations, but cannot by itself reconstruct full social context, individual motives, or specific chains of behavior, and thus cannot fully replace traditional investigative work. The investigative lessons from the case do not lie in a single technique, but in how diverse data sources are flexibly integrated. Old files are not treated as obsolete, but reread in light of new data, allowing overlooked details to gain meaning in a different analytical framework. The case underscores the importance of comprehensive record keeping, interstate data, interoperability, and maintaining cold cases in a state that allows re-access, because what cannot be resolved at one moment may become feasible when technology and understanding change. At the same time, it cautions against over-interpretation of modern data, reminding that having powerful tools does not mean every question can or should be answered with a definitive conclusion, especially when evidence has been eroded by time. On a social and legal level, the significance of the James Smith case extends beyond a single file, exposing past gaps in child protection systems and raising questions about societal responsibility toward individuals abandoned due to lack of connectivity and oversight. That a child could be taken, given a new identity, and live an entire life undetected reflects historical limits of law and administration, creating pressure for the modern system to avoid repeating similar errors. From a legal perspective, The case highlights the need to balance recognition of historical truth with protection of an individual's legal stability, as confirming identity after decades cannot and should not entail consequences that upend a lawfully built life. On a human level, the greatest meaning of the case lies in redefining the concept of missing. Disappearance does not always mean death, and behind every cold case file there may be a life that unfolded beyond the system's view. This brings cautious hope to families still waiting for answers, but also emphasizes that such hope must be accompanied by psychological preparation for incomplete outcomes, where truth is found but cannot fully repair the losses that occurred. Viewed overall, the James Smith case is not a story of complete justice victory, but proof of the ability to approach truth under limited conditions, where technology, investigation, and human effort together shed light on a forgotten part of history. Its significance lies in reminding that justice does not always take the form of a verdict, but sometimes exists as acknowledgement, connection, and the return of identity to those stripped of it long ago. In the ongoing accumulation of cold cases over time, James Smith's story becomes an important reference point, showing that pursuing truth, even if late and incomplete, still holds profound value for individuals, families, and society, and that reopening each file is not only an effort to resolve the past, but also a way for the system to learn to perfect itself and better protect people in the present and future. The James Smith story shows that in the United States today, community safety cannot rely solely on trust as it did in Alabama in 1952, when doors were unlocked, children played around the house, and adults assumed everyone in town knows each other. That very trust led to the initial mistake. Adults hesitated at unusual signs, allowing James to slip out of sight in just a few minutes. Then the scene was disturbed by spontaneous searching, leaving arriving police with no physical traces to follow. The practical lesson is to design safety through systems, not feelings. With young children, always have one clearly responsible adult, agree on meeting points, and enforce a never lose sight rule. If an incident occurs, prioritize calling 911 early, preserve the last seen area, limit access, and immediately record descriptions, timelines, and strange vehicle license plates, details that slipped away in 1952 due to conflicting witness memories and lack of recording tools. The story also reminds us that identity is more than paperwork. James lived his entire life under another name because new birth certificates and original records lacked connectivity. Today, families should keep copies of important documents, updated photos, medical records, identifying features, and teach children basic contact information safely. Finally, DNA genealogy reconnected a severed life, but also revealed its limits. Finding the person does not mean finding the perpetrator, as witnesses are gone and evidence depleted. Therefore, use technology as a tool for early prevention and tracing, but do not wait for data miracles. The most effective approach remains quick response, accurate recording, and building a disciplined community network, where care comes with procedure. If the James Smith story makes you reflect on what might have been missed, and what today's technology could change, please subscribe to the channel to join us in continuing to follow other cold case files, where the truth is sometimes still waiting to be named. Thank you for accompanying us to the very end, and see you in the next video, where another story thought to be buried forever will once again be brought to light.